Hey guys, so just continuing what we've been doing so far with our gate log system, you've been tasked with creating a user management screen. Now, this is my own, this is my design. I think it's a good design to follow and take a cue from. However, you know that I'm not trying to dictate to you and tell you that you must do anything the way I do it. So you do have your creative freedom to do it the best way you see possible. We're not going to build it from scratch because it's pretty much straightforward, in keeping with everything that we've done up to this point. We have a few labels, we have text boxes, I have a few buttons, and the only thing here that would be foreign to you really would be the gray outline here. So for this outline, or this layout rather, I'm using a layout control. So I'm just going to go to the toolbox and say layout. Sorry, say split. Alright, I'm using a split container, which then gives me two panels to either side. And then that allows me to put stuff on either side and have it stay in that space. I'm also using, for that big gray area, this gray box. That is my grid view. Alright. Now, we all should know by now that the foundation upon which all of our applications work is really events. So we have a bunch of events for each button, obviously. Today we'll be looking at the save new user. So save new user would be clicked when the user has filled in all of the required details for our user in keeping with the fields coming from our database. So your fields may look differently from my fields, but this is my users table, and these are all of the fields required. The one outlier is gender ID. We're using a combo box for gender ID, which we're going to bind and load up prior to allowing the user to create a user. All right. So just take a look at the code. We'll just right click and go to view code. And here I have my button click event for the save, and I have a few functions here that I built before. So as we go along and we see the need for each, I will expound on what each function is doing. The most critical things though are, one, we need to fire up an event that when the form loads, certain data is loaded with it, namely the data that would go in our gender combo box, and also the list of users that would populate our grid view, which should be presenting our users. So firstly, we need to have a form load event. That's the first event we really need. To get that form load event, you can just double click on the form itself, not on anything else but just the form, maybe up here, or you just right click, go to properties, and go to events, and then you select load, and then you create that. So you just double click in this space and it will jump to the code behind and give you a load function. Now I already have the code. I'm just going to walk you through what the code is doing step by step, and I also have comments to complement what it is that I'll be saying. And some of the comments are incomplete, so we'll just complete them and fill in the blanks as we go along. Now the first thing that we did, having declared our database object up here, I'm just initializing it here. So I declare up here, it's a private. I really didn't need this because we know it's a private if I leave it out, but I'll leave it there. VTDI gate logs, I'm calling it DB context. Once again, the name used here really does not matter in the grand scheme of things. All right. And then in the load function, I'm saying that when the form loads, I want to initialize this to a new instance. That's all this line is doing. You will see examples where all of that is done in one line. I prefer to break it up. If you want to do it in one line, then that's fine. As long as you don't run into any problems later on, then that's fine. So having loaded my database object, I now want to populate my gender dropdown, and this has a few steps, and we'll just pay attention to each one very carefully. So firstly, we want to get the list of genders from the database. That is the missing part of that sentence. So var genders, this variable here is being declared so that it can store whatever comes back from this query. We already established that we're using a language called LINQ, or Entity Framework, and this kind of abstracts that SQL centric language but allows us to perform very similar operations regardless. So this is saying I want to look inside the database that was declared up here, and I want to look inside the genders table, and then I want to bring back everything and cast it to a list. Alright, and this is a good practice. Once you're getting back a collection, just cast it to a list to spare yourself headaches in the future. We have the genders variable collecting a list of genders from our database. Having the list of genders, we are now telling the combo box, which I called CB combo box genders dot data source. So we're setting its data source to be the list of genders. So if we get back 2 genders here, then the list will have 2 genders, and the combo box should then take on whatever came back with that list. Having populated that with the list, it's still not complete, because what we're really getting back is a list of objects of type gender. So we still need to break it down to the combo box to say, inside each object that is coming back in this list, I want you to display what is in the name field or the name property, and I want you to be in a position to store in the backend whatever comes back in the ID. And the relevance of this is, remember that in our users table we're getting gender ID, we're storing gender ID. So gender ID, well, it has to be an integer, so whatever gender they select, even though they will be seeing male, female, or whatever name is assigned to the gender, we really are only interested in storing the ID that is associated with that record. And that is why we have to set the value member to ID. This doesn't necessarily have to be ID, it can be highly contextual based on what you're doing. I just think that this is a widely accepted practice and possibly best practice. Now we'll have to populate our grid view. So I abstracted this population code into a function. So we'll look at what this function does. Refresh grid view. So refresh grid view, and you can just hold on control and click on your method and it will jump to its definition. And I'm just going to expand that definition. Refresh grid view says declare a variable called users and let users be equal to, look in the database, look in all of the users and select. I'm running a little lambda expression here. We've been through lambda expressions. So we start off with our lambda token and our arrow. And then I am now initializing a vague or an abstract data type. Alright, an abstract object. So I'm not forcing it that it must be of type user, it must be of this, it must be of that. I'm just saying declare some random object. Just make sure you fill it out with these things coming back from each user object coming back from the table. And remember, each object represents each row. So for each row, I want to create an abstract object that will take its ID, the first name, last name, the gender, name, and I'll explain what this is doing here, the email address, and the username. Now, Entity Framework allows us to what you call lazy load related data. So in traditional SQL, you would have to do something like an inner join in order to get 2 tables to speak and to get a corresponding value, since all you have is the ID. In Entity, they allow you to just say, give me an object for this row, and then you can access the properties over there. So from here, I can just look at the gender ID or the gender name coming from the genders table as it relates to each record from the users table. Alright, so I don't want to be seeing 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 or any other number as the ID. I just want to be seeing the name. So that allows me to just bring back the name instead of having to bring back gender ID and then try and figure something else, something out later on. Now in lines 91 and 92, we're just setting the data source. So you'll find that any control that has a collection or allows for a collection of items, they have a data source property, and this data source is the list of users. And you would notice I also cast this one to list. So I have select, and I'm running all of that nice fancy code, and then at the end of the day I'm still casting it to a list. And then I'm setting the data source for my grid view, G, grid, V, view, grid view of users. I'm setting its data source to be the users list. And I'm just doing a refresh just to make sure that the data loads. Now I put all of this in a whole function because there will be a time when I'm going to have to reload the grid. Well, every time I make a change to the data, my preferred method or preferred action afterwards is to reload that grid to ensure that it's showing the current data. So that is why I just said refresh grid view, and I have it here as a function, so I can call it when the form is being loaded. Alright, so on form load, I want to refresh the grid view, and that function will handle all of that population, sorry, wrong one, the population and data binding of the data. So that's what that does. Then this block of code here comprises how I am changing the column names. So if you do up to this part, you'd see that all of the columns that are auto-generated as specified by refresh grid view, right? So there's an ID column, there's a first name column, last name column, then you're going to see a name column, an email, and username. The fact is, when it's auto-generating them, it's auto-generating names based on what the fields are, which are not necessarily human friendly because it is first name as one word, as opposed to first space name. So what you want to do is rename the columns. So I'm just getting grid view users, looking at all the columns, and then I can reference the column directly by its name. So I can use the integer index, because columns is really just an array, right? So I can look at, let me just bring up the IntelliSense. I can look for it via the index, and there's an overload that allows me to look for it via the column name. So I'm just getting each column by its column name that I know, and then I'm setting the header text to be equal to my preferred string representation. All right, and then two more things. I hide a column that I don't want to be displayed, which would be the ID column. I know by virtue of what my code is doing that the ID column is the first column that's going to come in this list. It's the first column that will be auto-generated. So I'm saying that I want GV users of all the columns give me subscript 0. So here I'm referencing it by name, here I'm referencing it by subscript by index. And I'm saying give me all of the columns, but I want index 0 and its visibility should be false. Alright, so there's a property here, visible, and I'm setting it to false, so it will hide it. But I do need it for when I'm going to perform my update and delete operations. So I can't get rid of ID, I just want to hide it so that the user doesn't see it, but programmatically we the programmers will know what is happening. And then after all of that, I'm just setting by default the first row to be the first one. So rows and columns act very similarly. They're both collections. Alright, so the grid view users has a collection of columns and it has a collection of rows, and I want the very first row, that's subscript 0 or index 0, to be selected. Alright, and I'm wrapping all of that inside of a try catch. So this is some exception handling happening here, where I'm going to try all of these operations, and if anything goes wrongly, I just catch and throw an error. So I can choose to throw an error. I can display a message box to say, hey, it's not working at this time. Alright, so I hope you understand what happened for the load function. If you don't, if my explanation of it was sketchy, then feel free to reach out to me and contact me with any questions that you may have. It could be that you just need to replay the video and go slowly and take it step by step, but that's why I give the video, so you can do this on your own time. But feel free to leave any feedback or reach out to me if there is anything that you are not entirely comfortable with. All right, thanks for watching.